Those of you who are following along closely in your order of service will have noticed that Dr. Bosson was supposed to be here this morning preaching, but he is under the weather. He's got a really bad cough. He's taken COVID tests, and we do not believe it is that, but he's definitely in no condition to be in public or preach this morning, so here I am. We wish him a speedy recovery, of course. And this means that I get to introduce this month's theme of reimagining responsibility and point to the fact that we are observing Women's History Month. Now, next week are two very special events when the womanist theologian and professor, the Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, is giving a workshop on Saturday and preaching on Sunday. And I guarantee these are things that you do not want to miss. You are all certainly welcome. The week after that, I will be talking about responsible sexual health by referring to our church's Whole Lives program. And later in the month, I'll be talking about rights and responsibilities. So, reimagining responsibility. What drives how we morally discern what our responsibilities are? Is it all cognitive, or does our heart and compassion play into it? Let's begin sorting this out by considering some definitions. Misters Merriam and Webster tell us the adjective responsible may be defined as liable to be called to account as the primary cause, motive, or agent, being the cause or explanation, able to answer for one's own conduct and obligations, able to choose for oneself between right and wrong, or liable to legal review or, in case of fault, to penalties. All of these flow down into the definition of the noun responsibility, the quality or state of being responsible, such as moral, legal, or mental accountability. So, while I intend to discuss rights and responsibilities in a few weeks, with a right being something to which one has a just claim, today we'll look at right as in right and wrong. We mentioned moral accountability as a facet of responsibility, and certainly morality is often intertwined with our consideration of what is right and what is wrong. In philosophy, moral responsibility is defined as the status of morally deserving praise, blame, reward, or punishment for an act or omission in accordance with one's moral obligations. Deciding what, if anything, counts as morally obligatory is a principal concern of ethics. So, is there a difference between morals and ethics? According to the Grammarist website, morals are the principles on which one's judgment of right and wrong are based. Ethics are principles of right conduct. So the two nouns are closely related and often used interchangeably. The main difference is that morals are more abstract, subjective, and often personal or religion-based, while ethics are more practical, conceived as shared principles promoting fairness in social and business interactions. For example, a politician's sex scandal may involve a moral lapse, a subjective judgment, while a politician taking money from a company he is supposed to regulate is an ethical problem. But of course, both ethics and morals may have a part in both situations. The next concept I want to spend a little bit of time on because I think it's important. Moral discernment is the ability to look at a particular moral or ethical situation and not only say, I like or dislike this situation or course of action, but also, why? According to theological ethicist James F. Gustafson, discernment requires some sensibility and flexibility, some pluralism of consideration that is ruled out by dedicated allegiance to single principles of interpretation or criticism. Now, As is the case, people have studied and come up with theories around such things, and hapless seminarians are required to read them. So, allow me to either remind you of or introduce you to Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. These stages of moral development are an adaptation of a psychological theory originally conceived by the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. The theory holds that moral reasoning, the basis for ethical behavior, has 6 identifiable developmental stages, each more adequate at responding to moral dilemmas than its predecessor. Kohlberg's 6 stages can be grouped into 3 levels of 2 stages each: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. According to Piaget, it is extremely rare to regress in stages, to lose the use of higher stage abilities. Nor can stages be skipped. Each provides a new and necessary perspective, more comprehensive and differentiated than its predecessors, but integrated with them. The understanding gained in each stage is retained in later stages, but may be regarded by those in later stages as simplistic, lacking in sufficient attention to detail. Much like the second grader smugly praising the first grader on his progress, never thinking of the sixth grader watching them both, it may be our tendency to look down on those in previous stages. Obviously, I'm not describing these to promote that way of thinking. I describe the 6 stages to help us understand why people may believe as they do, so that we can work with them rather than judge them, and to keep ourselves focused on our goals. I think it might be pretty easy to think of those we associate with Kohlberg's different stages when we think of different religions or attitudes toward religion, or even political affiliations. The first 2 stages are level 1, labeled by Kohlberg as pre-conventional, and are common in children. But it seems to me they are common in some attitudes toward religion and God as well. Stage 1 is obedience and punishment driven. Individuals focus on the direct consequences of their actions on themselves. It is egocentric, lacking recognition that others' points of view are different from one's own. There is deference to superior power or prestige. For example, an action is perceived as morally wrong because the perpetrator is punished. The worse the punishment for the act, the more bad the act is perceived to be. Now, such thinking, it seems to me, has led to the use of the threat of hell to keep people from acting in destructive ways. Another problem with the obedience and punishment-driven stage is it can give rise to an inference that even innocent victims are guilty in proportion to their suffering. Not just victims of poverty, hurricanes, and diseases like AIDS are assumed guilty, but the black kid assaulted by police is assumed guilty, or he wouldn't have been assaulted. Stage 2 is self-interest driven. It expresses the what's in it for me position, in which right behavior is defined by whatever the individual believes to be in their best interest. Stage 2 reasoning shows a limited interest in the needs of others, but only to a point where it might further the individual's own interests. We've moved from stage 1, punishment in hell stage, to a don't you want to go to heaven stage? While the first 2 stages are more typical of children, the next 2 stages comprise the conventional level of moral reasoning and are more typical of adolescents and adults. Stage 3 can be described as good intentions as determined by social consensus. The self enters society by conforming to social standards. Individuals are receptive to approval or disapproval from others as it reflects society's views. Teens might say, but it's what all the cool kids are wearing, /doing, /saying, /whatever. Their parents might respond, but what will the neighbors say? Or what would people think? People in this stage may try to be a good boy or good girl to live up to expectations, having learned that being regarded as good benefits the self. Stage 3 reasoning may judge the morality of an action by evaluating its consequences in terms of a person's relationships, which now begin to include things like respect, gratitude, and the golden rule. Stage 4 is authority and social order obedience driven. It is important to obey laws, dictums, and social conventions because of their importance in maintaining a functioning society. Moral reasoning in stage 4 is thus beyond the need for individual approval exhibited in stage 3. A central ideal or ideals often prescribe what is right and wrong. If one person violates a law, perhaps everyone would. Thus, there's an obligation and a duty to uphold laws and rules. When someone does violate a law, it is considered morally wrong. Most active members of society remain at stage 4, where morality is still predominantly dictated by an outside force. This stage 4 thinking reminds me of those who might point to a Bible verse and demand it be followed as they interpret it, no matter how clearly unfair it might be to women, gays, or others. Or those school administrators who have a zero tolerance policy, enforcing the rules no matter what the circumstances or consequences. Next, the post-conventional level, also known as the principled level, stages 5 and 6, is marked by a growing realization that individuals are separate entities from society, and that the individual's own perspective may take precedence over society's view. Individuals may disobey rules inconsistent with their own principles. Now, some theorists have speculated that many people may never reach this level of abstract moral reasoning. But I find hints of our 7 UU principles in the descriptions of these stages. In stage 5, which is social contract driven, the world is viewed as holding different opinions, rights, and values. Such perspectives should be mutually respected as unique to each person or community. I hear shades of our 4th UU principle here, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Laws are regarded as social contracts rather than rigid edicts. Those laws that do not promote the general welfare should be changed when necessary to meet the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Or, as Spock said in The Wrath of Khan, logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. This is achieved through majority decision and inevitable compromise. Democratic government is ostensibly based on stage 5 reasoning, and our 5th principle is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. In stage 6, which is universal ethical principles driven, moral reasoning is based on abstract reasoning using universal ethical principles. Laws are valid only insofar as they are grounded in justice. And our 6th UU principle is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. A commitment to justice carries with it an obligation to defy unreasonable laws, which brings to mind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his statement, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. His letter from Birmingham jail is an open letter written on April 16, 1963. The letter defends the strategy of nonviolent resistance to racism. It says that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws and to take direct action rather than waiting potentially forever for justice to come through the courts. Responding to being referred to as an outsider, he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Now, this may bring to mind another text. Civil Disobedience, published over 100 years before Dr. King's letter, is an essay by American transcendentalist and UU favorite, Henry David Thoreau. In it, Thoreau argues that individuals should not permit governments to overrule or atrophy their consciences, and that they have a duty to avoid allowing such acquiescence to enable the government to make them the agents of injustice. Thoreau was motivated in part by his disgust with slavery in the Mexican-American War. More recently, commenting on war from our first reading, Arundhati Roy said, "Wars will be stopped only when soldiers refuse to fight, when workers refuse to load weapons onto ships and aircraft, when people boycott the economic outposts of empire that are strung across the globe." In Stage 6, legal rights are considered unnecessary as social contracts are not essential for moral action. Decisions are reached categorically in an absolute way, which involves an individual imagining what they would do in another's shoes if they believed what that other person imagines to be true. The resulting consensus is the action taken. In this way, action is never a means, but always an end in itself. The individual acts because it is right, and not because it avoids punishment, is in their best interest, expected, legal, or previously agreed upon. Here is where I reiterate my warning about smugness. Before we think surely, as moral and intelligent UUs, we're all squarely in Stage 6, I would suggest that very few of us are Dr. King's or Henry David Thoreau's. I'm certainly not. And although Kohlberg insisted that Stage 6 does exist, he found it difficult to identify individuals who consistently operated at that level. I believe it's more of a goal for most of us, rather than a place that we reside. Perhaps, thinking again of Mr. Spock, a goal for the 24th century, when the United Federation of Planets will operate under a single central government, founded on the principles of liberty, equality, peace, justice, and progress, with the purpose of furthering the universal rights of all sentient life. So, let's keep the planet going until then. We are also kicking off the observance of Women's History Month, so I'm pleased to be able to tie that in with this concept. Carol Gilligan is an American feminist, ethicist, and psychologist, best known for her work on ethical community and ethical relationships. She worked with Kohlberg, but noticed all his research was done with men. She wondered what would happen if she included the other half of the population in her studies. She not only changed whom she asked, but what she asked and how she asked it. In the prevailing research instruments that are used in Western psychology, the scales of moral development, the questions which lead to the responses that are assessed, and the scales of identity contain two central value presuppositions. First, that morality is basically justice, and second, that identity is basically autonomy. Gilligan asked the respondents, how would you define what a moral problem is? And how would you describe yourself to yourself? The shift in questions asked made it possible to identify a different construction of the moral problem. That is, different from that presupposed in the psychological literature. Think back to Stage 4 when it was said, when someone violates a law, it is considered morally wrong. Morality as a problem of justice. Against the prevailing definition of morality as a problem of justice, and identity as the achievement of separation, morality emerges in Gilligan's work as a problem of care and responsibility, and identity the achievement of relationship. It is human experience, the experience of inequality and of attachment, that gives rise to two moral visions. One, the social contract vision of justice has been dominant in Western thinking thus far. But these two ways of moral thinking reveal different perspectives on the relationship between self and others, as unequal or equal, attached or detached. As we listen more carefully to the moral voice that speaks about interdependence and the problems of detachment, a voice articulated more frequently by women, different ways of thinking about power emerge, as well as different ways of understanding violence to others and to self. You see, our UU principles say that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, not just those who agree with us or those who are easy to like. It's the interdependent web of all existence, not just the parts that we like. Thomas Merton said, "The whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all these living beings, which are all part of one another and all involved in one another." So I end by asking, what would happen if we look at morality as a question of caring and responsibility, of interdependence and compassion, rather than about rules and laws? When we reimagine responsibility, perhaps instead of just asking, how am I accountable for what I did right or wrong, we might ask, how am I responsible to help others to thrive? My family, neighbors, those without a voice, across the world, the environment. We are always and will always be faced with questions of right and wrong. But as German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer acknowledged, compassion is the basis of morality. Amen.